Okay, so we're going to talk through airbrush equipment, setup, cleaning and hygiene, and then I will do a little bit of an extra video on techniques and ways to use the airbrush. So first of all, we're going to talk about the one that you've got in your kit. So what you have is a Sparmax compressor and airbrush, and just to clarify, they aren't the same thing. That is the airbrush itself, and this is the compressor. So with your compressor, you have a 5-year warranty. So make sure when you do empty all your box out, you don't throw away this bit and the instructions, because there's troubleshooting guides on there and just like information that's quite important to you. So keep that because it's your warranty, and it's quite nice to keep it in the box. So the compressor itself, this is your air hose, and it is a woven hose, and the reason is because there's lots of movement when you're using your airbrush, so it needs to be woven so it's strong. The hose will not be attached when you open up your airbrush, so it will look like this, similar on each end. You hold it and screw it in. Don't do it as tight as you possibly can, but it should be firm. Make sure that the hose is straight and there's no kinks or no twirly bits, because this is your air source. So the compressor is what gives you your airflow, and it comes up through this hose. So it needs to be as straight and as smooth as possible, and then it will attach to your airbrush in the same way, twist on. Okay, there is a hole in the handle, and that is to rest your airbrush in as you're working. So it sits in there nicely, which means you haven't got to bang it down on the station or whatnot. You put it in that little hole and it sits there lovely. So you've got a dial here, so you've got this little knob that you can turn. This determines how much airflow you have. So if you turn it all the way up to the top, you have maximum airflow. So that is if you were trying to clean your airbrush or put a big burst of air through it to kind of spray a big area. Any kind of detail stuff or small things, you're going to turn it down nice and low. So you've got a very gentle flow of air and a very soft, delicate, thin concentration. So it's adjustable. And on the back, you've got an on-off switch. When you're working with this is a professional level compressor, so this can be on for hours and hours at a time. If you're doing like a body paint or several people one after the other, you can leave this on, but you must leave this back bit clear so there's lots of airflow. If you put it right up against the wall like that, you'll find that it will overheat a little bit. So leave it out so you've got airflow all around it. Make sure your hose is straight, and then you've got your adjustable dial at the front. So the measurement of airflow that comes out of this compressor is PSI, pounds per square inch. Pounds per square inch is the pressure coming out. So generally speaking, when you're working on the face, the PSI should be kind of 2, 3, up to maybe 10. It might be up to about 15 on the body, but it should be relatively low. Your airbrush comes in its little case, and there is a worksheet that you will all have which details exactly what the mechanics of this airbrush are. This is a dual action gravity feed airbrush. So what that means is you've got a paint cup at the top, you pour your paint in, gravity pulls it down, you press the trigger and you pull it back, which releases the airflow and pushes that paint out of the end. So it's a gravity feed, meaning the paint comes down, or the foundation or whatever comes down. And it's a dual action, which means you can press down for airflow and pull back to allow more or less paint. If you pull back a tiny bit, you'll get a tiny bit of paint. If you pull back a lot, you'll get a lot of paint. So that's what that means. Some airbrushes have big cups on the bottom, some you just press down and up to release air. They all vary a little bit, but you've got one that you can vary and you can change depending on what you're trying to do. On the end of your airbrush, you've got a little chuck. If you turn this and tighten it all the way up like this, you'll have a very stiff trigger. If you unscrew it and make it really, really open, you'll have a very loose trigger. What this chuck controls is a long needle that is inside of this airbrush, which I'll show you. So inside of an airbrush, you will have a long needle like this. And it's this needle blocking the little hole at the end that controls how much paint you get. So when you pull the trigger back, the needle comes back, making the hole bigger, so you get more spray. And when you let it go, it goes forward and plugs the hole again. So that little chuck on the end of your compressor, not compressor, on the end of your airbrush, will determine how far forward or how far back that needle is. So if you tighten it, it will be slightly more far forward, and you loosen it, it'll be further back. Loosen it, you'll get more airflow. Tightening it, you get a tiny pinprick of airflow. So that's for detail, and then opening it is for spraying lots of coverage. With me? Okay. So that's your airbrush. Just getting it set nicely. Inside the cup is where your paint goes, or your product. The key thing with an airbrush is that you maintain it and you clean it. If you leave paint or foundation or whatever in this airbrush, it will dry, it will block it, it will not work. So you need to be able to clean it out in between uses. So what you'll need is airbrush cleaning fluid or just hot water. When you've finished with your paint, you pour it in, you spray it through to get a nice airflow. I will come to that in a minute. But as far as setup goes, you need to make sure everything is nice and tight. You've got a little bit of bounce on your trigger. It goes back and forth fully. Your hose has no knots. The compressor is away from the wall. As far as health and safety when airbrushing goes, you need to have good ventilation. So you need to have open windows or be in a big space, or if you don't have those things, you need to have some type of extraction or a fan or something. Because as you work with this, the paint can mist up and you can smell it, and it can make you cough, especially if someone's got asthma or something like that. It's the most hygienic form of makeup application because you never touch anybody's skin. You're always a few feet away spraying. So you're not gonna cross-contaminate. You're not gonna have to touch anybody, which in these times is lovely. It's very quick, it's very efficient. You can switch colors, you can switch products, you can do it for special effects, you can do it for bridal, you can put it into the hair. There's so much stuff you can do with this. So there's lots of benefits, but it is a little bit more expensive. And it is something that you need to be practiced in, okay? So that is everything you need to know as far as equipment and setup. Okay, so there's several types of paint that you can use. Water-based paint and silicone-based paint are the two that we work with. So water-based paints are better for body painting, fantasy. You tend to get really bright colors, they're thin, they're blendable, but they're not great for a foundation or something that's got to be on for a long, long time because they're water-based. Silicone-based airbrush makeup is like foundations, contours. You can get highlighters, blushers. They're a little bit kind of more flexible. They're really long lasting, and they're waterproof. So we are working with water-based because we're doing fantasy, body art, etc. And the way that these work is, and this is a better example. All these airbrush colors consist of pigment and a carrier. So the fluid needs to mix with the pigment in order to create the paint, which then will go into the airbrush. The reason it's like that is because this pigment is so fine. When it mixes with that carrier fluid, it's fine enough to come out of the airbrush. So in every bottle of airbrush paint is a little ball bearing, and as you shake it, you'll hear it click around like a spray paint. And you need to mix and mix and mix and shake and shake and shake these until you've got a really well mixed colour. If you don't, when you pour it out, you might think it's well mixed, but you pour it into the airbrush and all the pigments will split and clog up the gun. So really shake them up. And just so you know, when you first use your airbrush paints, they'll have a cap inside. So if you're like squeezing it thinking, why isn't it coming out? It's because of that. So take that out. And I would keep these and put them back in because it stops it from leaking up through the bottle. Really shake it. And then you can twist the top and you've got a dropper. Less is more when you're filling up your cup. Do not fill it all the way up to the very top because it's very unlikely that you're going to need that much paint and it will spill everywhere. So I'm doing maybe 10 drops or so, and that's all that I'm putting in to fill up at the moment. I can go back in and add more at any time. One thing I forgot to mention, in your actual airbrush itself, you get a little brush. That's to help clean out when you're finished. Get a little spanner, which is to start removing really small bits. My advice to you is I would never touch that, and there's no real reason you ever need to take off the tiny little intricate pieces inside of the airbrush. There's just no reason for you to really do that unless you are using the airbrush for parts, to be honest, because they're so delicate. If you try and mess with them, they'll break. You get an extra nozzle, which looks like a little crown, and that is for really big, wide spraying. So you want a big projection of colour, and a spare attachment for your hose. If you clean this properly, you will never have to replace anything. It will never break on you. If you clean it through every time, this will last you your whole career. So look after these. So I've filled up my cup, and on your worksheet you will see, as set out by City and Guilds, exactly what techniques you can use with an airbrush. So you can do masking, you can do corrective colouring, stencil work, blending, contouring, shading, fine line, freehand detail. I'm going to show you a bit of everything. So I'm going to show you on paper first of all. Compressor on. And just to get to grips with it, the way that you are going to need to hold this airbrush, doesn't matter if you're left or right-handed, but you're going to take your middle finger and it's going to go right next to the top of the hose, underneath the barrel of it. Your thumb's going to come around and pinch the other side. So the length of the airbrush sits nicely in your hand and rests like that. That leaves your index finger completely free to do your trigger work. What I don't want is this. I don't want people kind of holding it all kind of skew-iffy. You won't have maximum control and you'll spill the paint if you don't hold it properly. Finger underneath, pinch with your thumb, index finger's free then, okay? There are lots of effects that you will get with airbrush, but I want you to just experiment with different levels of pressure and different kind of techniques. So you can have low pressure, and you can work really closely. do fine detail. Experiment with how tight your needle chuck is to do detail. Loosen it up and higher pressure if you want to do kind of nice blending work. So the closer you are to the skin, the darker and more detailed your line work will be. The further you are, the more coverage you're going to have. You need to practice all aspects of airbrushing. I want you to be able to do a dark to light fade really easily. I want you to be able to do close-up detail. And I want you to be able to control the airbrush completely with one hand. Okay? Say you've been using it and you've sprayed through and you've run out of paint. You can either top up and continue, or you can change colours, or you can clean it out. If you were changing colours and you were going from light to a dark, you can pretty much just put the dark straight in and spray. If you need to go from, say, like black to white, you're going to need to clean your airbrush through, you're going to need to flush it through. So, airbrush cleaning fluid into the cup. There is a technique called back bubbling, and it is the first thing that you will do if you ever get a blockage, or if you need to change colour, mix colour, or clean it. So you put your finger over the nozzle and you gently pull back on the trigger, and it creates bubbles in the cup. Because you're blocking the air from coming out, it will flow back round and push up at the cup, which helps to clean it out. And you'll need to do that a few times until your airbrush is coming out clear again. Once it's coming out clear again, you can put your new colour in, carry on your way. If you finish with it for the day, then you know that you need to clean this thoroughly. Which is when you're going to use your little brush. You're going to need to clean around the tip of the nozzle. And completely inside the cup, right down in the bottom of the well. Turn your PSI right up, blast it through, back bubble. Could you grab me a cotton bud, please? Yes. Get a cotton bud. Tear up the end so it goes a bit kind of fluffy, and then that's really nice to clean. That will happen. And then to test that it is fully cleaned, you shouldn't be able to see any paint in there. And when you spray out, it should be completely clear. Okay, turn your compressor off, and there will still be a little bit of air in there, so spray that out before you then disconnect it. Every time you put it back in, just make sure it's nice and dry. Put it in there, disconnect your hose. Ensure that there's no kinks or knots or whatever. You can put your hose away, you can put the compressor away, and you can now put your airbrush away, and it's clean and it's good to go for next time.